Welcome to the ISM Rochester Lunch and Learn webinar series. Our program for today is coming out of the pandemic and supply chain disruption. I do have one little program note. I want to let everybody know that next week on January 18th, we will be having our monthly membership meeting. It'll be on our Zoom membership, our Zoom meeting platform, and our speaker will be Jane Tierney. So I hope everybody can join us for that particular program as well. And we would like to hear from you today. So please use the chat function or our Q&A just so that you can put in your question for our speaker today or any comments that you may have along the topic. Our speaker today will be Tom Cook, who is the CEO Managing Director of Blue Tiger International, a premier international business consulting company on supply chain management, trade compliance, purchasing, global trade, and logistics. Tom was the former CEO of American River International in New York and Apex Global Logistics Supply Chain Operation in Los Angeles. He has over 30 years of experience in assisting companies all over the world to manage their import and export operations. He is a member of the New York District Export Council, sits on the board of numerous corporations. Tom is also the director of National Institute of World Trade, a 30-year-old probably 30-year-old plus educational and training organization based on Long Island. At this time, I'd like to turn the program over to our speaker today, Tom Cook.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. Happy New Year to everybody. And as always, Kathy, we appreciate your setting this up. You do a great job for all the ISM groups you work for, and obviously also including Rochester. So at any point in time, if anybody has a question or comment, please feel free to raise your hand and jump in. The more interactive we make the presentation, the better it will be. But we'll also leave time at the end to handle any questions that you might have. So obviously, the general sensibility about the world is that we're coming out of COVID, or I would say the more serious consequences of COVID, because many of us still fully realize that COVID is still going on. But the impacts of COVID in the supply chain have been significantly diminished over the last year. And particularly, I think everything has expedited itself in closing out COVID, probably from about September, October on forward. And as we move into 2023, a lot of the issues that are involved with COVID have significantly dissipated, particularly as it relates to the transportation infrastructure in international business. So as Kathy mentioned to you, I run a company called Blue Tiger International. We're based in New York with 9 facilities around the country and a number of footprints in international markets. We basically help companies manage their global supply chains, particularly focused on reducing risk and spend, trade compliance, and various operational issues. So the conversation today is going to be focused on the things that are coming out of COVID that we've learned that give us various specific lessons and specific topics and things that we can look at in our own business models to make improvements. So it's kind of good to frame the issue is that when COVID broke out in February of 2020, that really started a chain of events which really impacted all aspects of importing, exporting, and also domestic shipments, not only the domestic portion of an international transportation, but for those of us just involved in domestic supply chains, it had a huge impact as well. And here we are now, 36 months after the fact, and for most of us looking back, it went like a snap of a finger these last 3 years, even though for the most part it dragged on. But here we are now coming out of this whole thing. And when we look back, we realize that there was really no single cause of the problem, nor a single answer to the management of the problem. And there are clearly signs that the disruption is subsiding, and particularly as we enter into 2023, that momentum of subsidization has actually increased pretty dramatically. But we know that there are still lingering issues. But I think a factor that's important here is that through COVID, all of us have really learned to just better manage this disruption and find ways to navigate around it and so forth. So whether you take the position it's still here or it's gone, the factor is that we really have become better at managing our responsibilities in the face of the disruption. The three key areas that are involved relates to delays, cost, and uncertainty. The whole transportation infrastructure of the world and here in the United States really was impacted by the fact that things did not happen as timely and as responsibly as we would have liked it to happen. Those delays are significantly diminished now. So just as an example, if I was handling an ocean freight import out of Asia into the United States, the lead time would probably be about 60 to 90 days in when we would place orders. And it would take, once an order was done, maybe 25 to 35 days to get here and so forth. So you had a 4 to 5 month cycle in international business. But in fact, at the height of the COVID, which was around November of 2021, things could take as much as a year from beginning of the process of ordering to when it was actually received. And that obviously 6-month variance was a huge factor in how companies went about its demand planning process and was handling its supply chain responsibilities. Costs went through the roof as well. In that same example of a import transaction coming in from Asia to the United States, the average cost of a 40-foot container coming in was around $2,500 in January of 2020. By November of 2021, that price escalated to more than $20,000, increasing that price by more than 10 times. And that cost now is back down to that $2,000 level. And as a matter of fact, I was talking to a couple of transportation companies last week based out in California, and they're talking about the fact that the pricing is actually even more competitive than it was in January of 2020. But those delays and those costs created a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and particularly for those of us in supply chain and for those of us in procurement and those of us that were involved in demand planning, that's created uncertainty. And coming through that now, we're still uncertain about specifically how much lead time we actually need and how much dependence can we rely on our suppliers to deliver their products and services on a timely basis. So the comments going forward in framing these issues is really the different things that we want to look at to actually make our supply chain run better and more effectively. So we have kind of bundled the solutions into these 12 lessons that we learned. They are that lean inventory management is over. I'm going to address each one of these topics separately, but I want to just cover them in general. That performance is becoming a key driving factor over price. The need for diversity in sourcing, the need for multiple suppliers has grown dramatically. The supply chain and procurement responsibility in organizations, the bar has been raised pretty dramatically. That hybrid remote, the way companies operate their business with personnel, is here to stay. Vendor management has evolved. The cost of freight has evolved. Landed costs are being scrutinized, meaning the entire cost to acquire merchandise, goods, and services. Near sourcing, or bringing manufacturing distribution closer to the States or back to the States, has a new revival. Personnel acquisition has changed, and paying attention to detail has become a much more important factor. So let's dissect these 12 areas. The first is that lean inventory management is over. Previous to COVID, I spent the last 20 years working with companies at creating lean manufacturing and lean distribution, inventory management, and operational systems. Okay, when COVID came into play in February, March of 2020, that changed everything from that point over. We had a 3-month period in which the whole world basically stopped in every aspect of business. Everybody had inventories move at that point in time, but the replenishment cycle changed dramatically, as we talked about earlier, from a typical 6-month cycle to as much as a 12-month, 18-month cycle it moved to. So more and more companies are looking at the inventory management systems, and obviously they're trying to make them as cost effective as possible, But really what's changed is safety stock, which is that companies maybe kept the safety stock of 5 to 10%, knowing that the supply chain could fulfill their needs pretty easily. We're seeing more companies having safety stocks as high as 100%. I would say on general, it's averaging as much as 50%, but we have some companies in certain product areas, 100%. So there's a cost associated with carrying that much inventory. Obviously, there's space issues, there's manpower issues that have to be addressed, okay? But the idea is that the concept of lean inventory management, particularly from a senior manager perspective, has changed because no one wants to be in that vulnerable position that they were in the spring of 2020. Now, I know that historically there are always knee-jerk reactions, and I think we're in that knee-jerk reaction currently now, which means that the vulnerability created about inventory management through 2020 is still with management today as a concern and a risk. But I'm sure as time moves on, and if there's continualization of normalization in the supply chain, and it comes back to where it was pre-COVID completely, I think that more companies will probably slide back because their memory of what happened will be diminished, and we'll get back to lean inventory management. But I think we're probably at least a year to 2 years out where that becomes a normal part of the cycle of inventory management. Performance over price. I think every purchasing manager, everybody in operations and supply chain had their thumb on their vendors and suppliers in trying to negotiate a lower price. But through COVID, we were just happy to get something, okay? We were just happy to make sure that there was some ability to acquire product in some reasonable time frame into our manufacturing or distribution systems, okay? So what changed was we're not as concerned about price. We're more concerned about the availability of the product and the availability to get it into our inventory and distribution system when we need it. So performance through COVID has been a primary driving factor. And I believe that it will continue to be a much more important factor than it ever has been before. And again, as we get further away from COVID and our memories start to lapse, it'll slip back and we'll eventually get back where price will be a driver. But I think a lot of supply chain executives and a lot of senior management companies are recognizing the vulnerabilities that were created, okay, and therefore are managing it a little bit more differently, a little bit more conservatively, and valuing performance well above price. The need for diversity in sourcing. This is a major issue that has had huge impacts, not only here in the United States, but all over the world. And the big issue here is that a tremendous dependency, as much as 40% of our foreign purchasing, was all concentrated in China. And we had major issues in China being able to honor their obligations because COVID had a huge impact in China. And for those of you that are paying attention to this, it's still having a huge impact in China. And they have what's called a zero tolerance policy, which means that once an area is impacted by COVID to a certain extent, they close it down. They don't allow people to leave their homes, the stores and all the retailers are shut down, manufacturing is shut down, transportation infrastructure shut down, people moving in and out of that geographic area shut down, and basically nothing happens. And that's had a huge impact on the world where that particular area may have been manufacturing something that was being shipped out of the country. So a lot of companies saw that vulnerability and started to diversify the amount of places that they source from. So it's not just finding another manufacturer in China, it's now finding a manufacturer somewhere else. Is it India? Is it Malaysia? Is it Vietnam? Is it Taiwan? Or is it actually coming back to the United States or closer to what we call nearshoring, meaning maybe Mexico or Canada? So there's a whole trend of this. The Department of Commerce actually is watching this as closely as they can. And they said about, through COVID, about 6% of the manufacturing in the world has left China, which is a pretty high amount, and that they anticipate that within the next 2 to 3 years, as much as 20% will have left China. And some companies are not leaving completely, but they're reducing their footprint in that marketplace. The key is that companies need to think as a risk management supply chain strategy that diversity is a critical aspect. Coming up to COVID, a lot of companies concentrated on singular-based sourcing because they're focusing all their spend with one supplier, and therefore they're getting great deals in doing so. But from a risk management strategy, they're realizing that that focused spend has created a certain amount of risk. So more and more companies are looking to a more conservative approach or a risk management approach by diversifying their sourcing. This ties also into just the need for multiple suppliers. By the spring and summer of 2020, when COVID was really impactful all over the world, if you were trying to change a supplier at that point in time, it wasn't going to happen. Okay, because suppliers were filling their current client needs and they weren't taking on new clients. Our sourcing group in our own company struggled at that time. We found manufacturers in different places around the world, but they weren't able to take on new volumes of business because their own problems with manpower and their own problems with infrastructure. So a lot of companies have taken up now where they tier their suppliers, okay? And in that tier one category, those critical areas of spend, I use the formula 80-20, meaning that the tier one should be 20% of your suppliers that represent 80% of your spend. And also in that category would be companies that might not have a lot of spend, but the nature of their product or service is critical to your supply chain. They fit into that tier one category. So a lot of companies in a risk management strategy have developed in that category of tier one, multiple suppliers, having your primary supplier, a secondary supplier, and a tertiary third supplier in there. And not completing the spend, but maybe doing 60% of the spend in that primary supplier and the other 40% split up between the other two companies. Yes, you're not focusing your spend and maybe not getting the best deal from a pricing standpoint, but at least you know that if you lost your primary supplier or your primary supplier was impacted negatively, that you have two other options that you already have a footprint in. And that's the concept of that strategy. The next is supply chain and procurement. The bar has been raised. And I would hope that all of you in your responsibilities in various aspects of procurement, supply chain, and operations are feeling that. And I guess the best example of making the point here is that in all the years that I've been involved, which is now more than 30, involved in procurement and supply chain, I've always found that whether you're talking about a multinational Fortune 500 company or you're talking about a company that does $50 million of business a year, that supply chain has always been a secondary function of importance in a company and an afterthought, meaning that a company looks to do its business development, and then once it has gotten sales overseas or domestically, they then go to supply chain and say, okay, here's what we have to do. If they look for foreign sourcing, they create a foreign sourcing opportunity, and then they hand over to supply chain. Okay, you need to make sure you're able to import these goods and handle all the logistics and the supply chain responsibilities. It's always a secondary position. But through COVID, because supply chain became such an important aspect of companies, that it actually has had the attention of the C-suite to the extent that it never had before. I was given a presentation back in the summer of last year to a group of CEOs of companies in a particular trade association. And I made the point that I have spoken to more CEOs and CFOs in the last 3 years than I have in the prior 20 years of my business experience. And that's because the supply chain issues went all the way up to the C-suite. And I think in a lot of organizations, the C-suite has recognized the importance of supply chain to their business model, to the success and sustainability of their business, that they've elevated that position. And that elevation means that you might have a seat at the table. A new position, I was talking to somebody at Korn Ferry, which is a high-end executive recruiting company looking for talent search. They're saying they see a huge impact in major companies creating a CSO, a chief supply chain officer, which is in the same category of the chief financial officer, chief legal officer, chief operations officer, and so forth. So that clearly shows and demonstrates that it's being elevated. And with that comes additional monies and additional responsibilities and perks and benefits, which all of us should be feeling in our own organizations. If you're not, then I think managing up is something that needs to be considered. Hybrid remote is here to stay. My company, we had brick and mortar up until 2013. So we've been remote and operating remote in our 9 locations around the country pretty successfully. So we were way ahead of the curve that happened as a result of COVID. So most companies, as they bring people back to the companies, is offering a lot of hybrid situations where you spend so many days back at the office and so many days remotely. I'm also very conscious that some of the larger companies are actually allowing remote to be their primary source of how people are managed. I would argue that in some venues that hybrid is not as effective as people being actually on site and in the office, mainly because of factors of mentoring and coaching and collaborative process and camaraderie become more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult in hybrid and remote situations. Okay, but the reality is that COVID has created a circumstance where a lot of companies, whether they want to or not, are being forced to creating the hybrid and the remote models in order to attract people. Obviously, we're all aware of the fact that in the United States and in some other Western countries around the world, hiring qualified people is a very difficult thing to happen today. A lot of people have extracted themselves from the workforce, making the situation where there are as many as 25 to 30% more jobs than there are people to fill those jobs. In good times prior to COVID, the ratio was around 5 to 10%. It's now in the neighborhood of 30 to 40% of unavailability of people. So that's a huge impact. So I'm going to make a comment towards the end of this discussion and presentation about the fact that, we have to learn how to better navigate our responsibilities in these hybrid situations. Vendor management has evolved, and the point that I want to make here that's important is that, prior to COVID, managing vendors has always been a responsibility, but the intensity of that was what I would call reasonably diminished prior to COVID. But through COVID, we recognized the importance of the value of relationship and the tightness of control that we need to have with respects to a vendor. So in that tier 1 category of vendors, the key issue really is to making sure that we're managing their vendors. So you could have a manufacturer, let's say, that's based in Asia somewhere, and they need raw materials and components to do the manufacturing. So they have their own group of tier 1 suppliers. So in this case here is that you're very concerned, or should be very concerned, of their ability to get the materials that they need to make the products that they're selling to you. So vendor management has changed where you're now involved with your vendor in making sure that they're involved with their tier 1 suppliers so that the obligations can be fulfilled. And while in some organizations this has happened prior to COVID, it's now happening at a much greater pace and with a greater degree of intensity since COVID has taken place. And in a couple of vendor management classes that I teach for other ISM groups, we get into this conversation about raising the bar of how we can more intensely manage our vendor and therefore have a much more successful vendor relationship in getting them to perform on a more timely and responsible basis. And that might be something for you to consider talking to Kathy and the team here. Maybe another webinar we might want to do later in the spring is talking about raising the bar of vendor management. The cost of freight has evolved dramatically. And we talk about the high points where freight was escalated to as much as 10 to 15 times more expensive than it was as things moved through COVID. But in the international arena, that pricing is actually coming down to pre-COVID terms. But in other areas, such as in air freight, uh, uh, time deliveries, meaning overnight delivery services, domestic trucking, and domestic warehousing and 3PL services, the pricing actually escalation of that through COVID is started to come down. But what our belief is, it will never come down to the pre-COVID pricing that it once has, meaning that we're anticipating and guiding our clients that in those areas of air freight, domestic freight, warehousing, 3PL services, expedited services, and so forth, will probably remain in the neighborhood of 20 to 25% higher than they were prior to COVID. Okay, so managing our carriers and managing our third-party companies that help us in our distribution and our warehousing is a critical element, and having conversations with multiple companies to know what our options are is going to be a critical factor of us being able to succeed. And just the subject of warehousing, just to give you a perspective, that prior to COVID, in the United States, about 83% of all the warehouse space available in the United States prior to COVID was used, which left us a little bit more, less than 20% available. Today, about 98% of all the warehouse space in the country is actually being utilized today. Okay. And because there's so much inventory balances with most of corporate America, it'll be a long time before those balances are diminished enough to get back to that 20% mark. So for probably at least 2-3 years, we're anticipating that the cost of warehousing and 3PL will continue to be on the higher level because of the fact that there's a tremendous amount of inventory and it's not going to diminish quickly. The subject of landed costs. The landed costs are all the costs that are involved to acquire a product and bring it to value. In an import transaction, we list these in these 5 silos. The first is the acquisition cost of the merchandise, what we pay for it, the freight to move it from point A to point B, the customs clearance process and the expenses associated with that, duties and taxes, and inland freight, warehousing, and distribution. So more and more companies are siloing these expenses because it gives us what the value of these services and these areas that we require. And therefore, if we understand what the cost is and what the value is, we then can look at where can it be potentially reduced. So as an example, in the category of duties and taxes, what determines what the duty rate is what the cargo is and where is it from. So if we're importing something from China and it's a particular product, we can see what the duty rate is. But if we import that same product from India, we might have a different duty rate, and it's likely that duty rate might be lower. If we were to import something from Mexico, as an example, there would be no duty rate because under the NAFTA agreement, which is now called USMCA, okay, there's no duty on goods coming from Mexico and Canada and the United States between the 3 countries. So to impact duties and taxes, as an example, where we source from could be a major factor in there. So in our business model, when we help a company look at this issue, we determine what these 5 silos are in their supply chain. Okay, and this could be a domestic purchase, could be an international purchase, or it could be an export transaction out of the country. We're able to look at these same silos and therefore dissect any one of these areas to see what steps could be taken to reduce risk and cost. And we're finding that more and more companies, that the people in procurement, supply chain, business development, and so forth are looking at this at a much more detailed level than they're ever looking at this before. Tied into this is near sourcing has a new revival. So I talked about the diversity in sourcing, about looking to other countries around the world to source in, but near sourcing is bringing sourcing closer to home. and that means Canada, Mexico, or the United States. So the Department of Commerce watches this, and through COVID, about 3% of the manufacturing has returned to the United States, which is relatively no number, but in the scope of scale, it's actually a very large number of activity, and it means it's moving in the right direction, that manufacturing is slowly coming back to the United States. And most of that has to do with the vulnerabilities that companies felt by having manufacturing done overseas, and through COVID, not being able to get the goods delivered timely and certainly not inexpensively. Okay, so as a risk management strategy, a lot of companies are looking that way. It's looking at the risks associated with foreign purchasing and the costs involved with foreign purchasing as compared to sourcing closer to home. And specifically, when we talk about Mexico, everybody should be aware that Mexico has a program called the Maquiladora, and the Maquiladora is specifically set up in an agreement between the United States and Mexico to allow Mexico to do manufacturing in Mexico, where they would have significant financial and tax advantages in Mexico, as well as here in the United States for the companies that work with Maquiladoras in manufacturing in Mexico. Mexico is now becoming the new China that existed about 25 years ago. We actually have now hired an engineer working in Mexico to help us with the volume of goods that we're now shifting from Asia into Mexico for near sourcing. Personnel acquisition has changed. This specifically relates to the issue that I discussed earlier, which is that in the United States here, we have a serious problem going on with the fact that companies are not able to hire people successfully and very readily in particular areas in any kind of white collar position in companies, and particularly in the area of purchasing and supply chain operations, manufacturing. This has become a serious issue. So most HR people in that area working with the silos in their company of hiring people have now created what they call a supply chain of talent, and they're proactively involved in recruiting from universities at the lower end and in various trade associations at the higher end, and engaging headhunters to keep a flow of quality people available to them at the time that they need it. And it's just another whole cost of operating your company, but it's a necessary cost so that when you need people to grow the business or to replace people who are leaving, you have places to go to that can respond pretty quickly. Paying attention to detail. In a lot of companies, supply chain managers, people in purchasing would outsource a lot of the responsibilities to third parties, freight forwarders, custom house brokers, sourcing agents, as an example, consultants and so forth, and would continue to work at a higher level of the things that they're involved with. But COVID caused all of us to have to pay attention to detail at a much greater extent than we ever had before. The example I give in international business is if you had an inbound shipment that was going to come in from Asia into the United States, and you handed it off prior to COVID to a freight forwarder, you'd call up a freight forwarder and say, here's what I have going on. And they would handle every aspect of it. And in a reasonable circumstance, it would be in your facility when you needed it there within a certain amount of days. But all of a sudden, when that wasn't happening, we had to also find out, are there containers available in that trade lane? Are there chassis available in that trade lane? Is there manpower at that port to handle the goods on a timely basis? Are there drivers and trucks available to move the goods from point A to point B? And if I have an intermediate point, am I going to find a location that can load and unload a vehicle? Right? We got down to this tremendous level of detail that we now had to pay attention to because of all this disruption that has occurred. And I think that through that learning curve, many of us realized that there was a value for us to pay attention to that detail because we learned how things operate at a much more granular level in the supply chain. It made us more aware, it made us more informed, and ultimately made us better at what we do in that understanding. So I think the importance of paying attention to detail was one of the positive things that came out of COVID for all of us involved in operations, procurement, and supply chain. So from that, we've created 6 strategies that we recommend to companies consider. The first is to look at these 10 items, and now actually I made it 12 concepts, and see how they apply to the specifics of your supply chain. And if they have value, then bring them in, okay, and actually apply them. Next is to create an assessment process. I'm going to dissect that for you in a moment, but basically it's creating a perspective of where you were through COVID and where you are now, and then deriving specific steps, strategies, and actions and tactics that you can take to make things from a mitigating standpoint of potentiality of another potential pandemic or disruption, okay, to the everyday activities running more effectively, both from a cost standpoint and from a business process standpoint. We also have to think about the fact that there's a recession looming here in the United States and around the world. In some countries around the world, they've already declared a recession in their local market. I'm a firm believer that a recession may be looming, but I think we're going to have a softer landing than most people are anticipating. There are a lot of signs in the economy, and one of them is that people are still spending money. Consumers are still spending money at a pretty high rate. 2, that our inventory balances, though are high, really give us a tremendous amount of leverage in the fact that we have a lot of the raw materials, components, parts, and finished products that we need, both not only in the short term, but in the long term. And that companies are still hiring, okay? While the news portrays some of the bigger companies that are laying off people, okay, which obviously is happening, there's still a huge amount of larger companies and middle market companies that are aggressively out there hiring people. And we do know that there are really more jobs available than there are actual people available. And those are good signs, which indicates to my economic advisory staff that thinks that while times will get a little bit worse, that we'll probably have a softer landing than some of the authorities are predicting. We need to think about creating a strategy for maintaining, finding, and hiring quality personnel. And this is because of the circumstances that are out there, that there are more jobs available than there are more people. And the subject of maintaining is that a lot of companies are now creating very strong, compelling arguments for people to stay in their business. They're paying them more money. They're creating more lucrative bonus programs. They're creating more perk programs for them to be attracted so that people don't have reasons to leave the company from the deal that they're being offered. And more astute and what I call wise leadership in companies are also now realizing the importance of their employee or staff and organization. And they're really now emulating, they're caring about that more and spending more time in leadership and management training and services and capabilities to make the company run more responsibly and to make sure that things are communicated timely and responsibly, and that there's a favorable structure in place, and that people who are stakeholders really do have a say in how the company is being run. So that concept of maintaining, a lot of companies are changing their business models to bring the employees to a higher level in the organization. And as I mentioned before, having HR departments creating a very proactive pipeline of the availability of people, both at the lower level, meaning coming out of colleges and universities, and at the higher level, various trade associations and networking and organizations where potential hires might be found. Additionally, we need to be thinking about and preparing for consolidation, acquisitions, and mergers in transportation continuing to occur. Two such mergers in transportation. One is that Kuehne Nagel, which is one of the largest freight forwarders in the world, acquired Apex Logistics, which is one of the largest Asian-based transportation companies in the world, evidencing the importance of the Asian market, not only currently, but it will continue to be down the road, both as a manufacturer and source of merchandise, but also as a growing market for us to sell our products and services to as well. We also saw Maersk Line now make several acquisitions. One of them was Pilot Freight Services, because Maersk Line is an ocean steamship line, has now gotten into the freight forwarding, custom house brokerage, and domestic supply chain services. Earlier in the year, they also didn't acquire, but they started up an airline service so that they could also compete in the air freight market and offer their clients that use them for ocean freight services also in the air freight world. We've also seen a number of large trucking companies buy warehouses, and we've seen a number of 3PL organizations buy trucking companies and buy and expand their warehousing and so forth to create a much greater footprint. And we're going to continue to see those consolidations, mergers. One, there's a significant amount of capital out there in the market for them to do that. Two, they're taking steps to eliminate some of their competition. And three, they're expanding a lot of the venue and the services and what they call bundling now, which is to be able to go into a company and say, we can handle every aspect of your supply chain, from the transportation side to the storage, the fulfillment, the distribution of your products and services, both nationally and internationally. The last point is to focus on resource and training development. Is a lot of the more astute companies are recognizing that they have to invest internally. So they've got to create additional resources for their people to access. And there's usually costs associated with that. So they're budgeted at a higher level than they ever have before. And they're also focused on training, both ranging external training and internal training for their people to bring up their skill sets and their capabilities, and to invest in their people's abilities to grow and to help them grow, to become more valuable to themselves and to become more valuable to their organizations. So we talk about the assessment process. The suggestion that we make here in creating an assessment process is the first thing to do is to create a team of stakeholders. The stakeholders are those people in your company who would be impacted by any aspect of the area of responsibility that you're involved with managing. So if you were involved in procurement, anybody involved in logistics and supply chain, manufacturing, distribution, sales, and so forth would be parties that are all impacted. So you want to have them all involved in the input. The second thing is to conduct the post-mortem. You got to sit down, excuse me, around a round table and have a conversation about the impact of COVID specific to your supply chain and your business model, how you were impacted negatively, how you navigated some of those things to produce favorable results, and where are you at now? Where are you looking to head to, which is really to identify, how you're going to get there. You need to look at what went right, what decisions did you make that were clearly good decisions, and what decisions were made that were incorrect or wrong, or created more risk or exposure or cost than anticipated. It's an introspective review. Then you have to identify, going forward, where are there areas of risk and cost that still exist. And then the last step of the process is creating a strategy that you're going to present to senior management to improve, that's going to identify how you're managing all those aspects of risk and cost going forward. And one of the biggest areas of risk that I think you have to think about is going back to the 12 steps that I outlined, such as where are we buying from and what are the risks associated with that? And where we are buying from, what are the risks associated with how we move the goods from that point to ourselves? Not only the risk, but what are the costs involved as compared to other options that might exist? And then that assessment actually comes together collaboratively, which becomes a strategy, then becomes tactics that senior management supports. So there are other things that I think you need to think about, because to make all these things happen, it requires you to be paying attention to skill sets to a much higher degree. So the skill sets that we focus on when we come into a company, first is communication skills. And this is a subject that needs to be addressed, because we basically have three methods of communicating. We can pick up the phone, we can text, we can email, and we can create presentations such as the one that we're involved with here. And our younger generation tends to text because that's what they grew up with doing. Our older generation tends to pick up the phone. But the reality is that all the methodology needs to be incorporated, but we have to recognize that every scenario and situation may require a different type of approach on how we make the presentation. And the more effectively we understand how we should approach the communication, we'll make that communication more effectively. Because at the end of the day, a communication is like a negotiation. You're trying to inform, you're trying to influence, you're trying to change behavior, you're trying to move somebody in a certain direction, which is really a negotiation, because that's what you're trying to do there, which then ties into the fact that we really should be focused on, upping our negotiation skills, and to be able to, negotiate better, not only as it relates to our business, but if we become a better negotiator, it obviously has value in our personal life as well. We need to manage up. And I think one of the things that happened in COVID is that all of us in procurement and, again, supply chain operations had to spend a lot of time managing up. There were many situations where I get a call from a CEO and would say to me that, my, director of purchasing who working with you told me that this is the way that we need to go. And I need to hear that from you. And I would reiterate what I told the director of purchasing, maybe embellish on it a little bit more for the benefit of the CEO. And the idea is that why is the CEO coming to me? It's because the procurement director didn't communicate it responsibly or articulate it, or hadn't established a level of trust and comfort level. So they come back and second guess them. So managing up, at the end of the day, is establishing a rapport with you, the people you report into, where they're comfortable with you, they trust you. When you tell them that, it's snowing in the middle of August, that they believe you. And in fact, that's what the case is. It's okay for them to might want to second guess or require evidence or proof, and that's perfectly acceptable. But at the end of the day, managing up is establishing an upward ability to establish trust, comfort level, and the ability to have an open, honest, direct conversation to get things done, because it's a necessary part of the deal. We obviously also have to manage in, manage out, and down. In would be with our colleagues, out would be our vendors, suppliers, and customers, and down would be if we're in a manager position and have subordinates reporting into us. So managing in all four directions is critical, but through COVID, managing up became the more serious challenge. We need to really consider about organization and prioritization. I think, again, from COVID, it became more important to us to organize and prioritize everything more importantly, because the implications were so critical if we didn't do it correctly and didn't do it in a timely or do it in a fashion that was necessary under the set of circumstances that we were dealing with, which falls right into time management, the ability to manage our time more effectively. And this was greatly impacted by the hybrid and the remote working, because all of us that were working from home all of a sudden now had other personal responsibilities that interface with us. The physical location that you were in had implications on it, right? The hours that you worked had implications. The space you were physically in, the resources that you had available to you, or lack of resources that you had available to you, and so forth, all had an impact. So our ability to manage our responsibilities in a hybrid situation became critical. And lastly is problem resolution, is that all through COVID, particularly at the front end, we were dealing with serious problems. Some of us faced problems we never faced with before, okay? Or the seriousness of the problem was expanded upon dramatically. So our ability to resolve problems and bring them to a favorable close is a skill set all by itself. As many of you know, I came out of the military. I went to one of the academies, and this was a big issue for us in training early on. Is that, hey, you're going to be met with challenges and problems, and you have to quickly provide solutions. And in the military, it always became a life and death situation in many issues and so forth. So the critical aspect of problem resolution was, going to impact whether somebody lived or died. But in business and commerce, generally that's not the consequence. But the successful solution to a problem is critical to the sustainability and profitability of the organization. So our ability to create problem resolution is critical. And I reach out to Kathy here that may be another webinar that we look at. There are actually a science behind problem resolution that we could have as a discussion all by itself. And lastly is that whether we like it or we don't like it, it's here to stay, at least I would say for the next year or 2 years, that remote people working either full-time remotely or in a hybrid situation is out there. And for all of us who are out there as remote workers, we need to be able to manage ourselves to all these areas to the left of, if we're in a hybrid situation, how we should communicate, how we should negotiate, how we should manage in all the directions that we need to, how we organize, prioritize time management, and resolving problems in that remote capacity. If we have people who are working for us, we need to learn how to manage them, because managing people remotely and from a hybrid standpoint is very different than when they're sitting across the hall from you or in a cubicle down the road from you, so forth. So that all by itself is another whole science that a lot of companies are spending time on as they have these hybrid models. How do we make people at the end of the day work for us effectively and responsibly in that hybrid situation? So with that, I appreciate everybody's kind attention, and we'll open it up to any questions that anybody or comments that you might have.
Oh, thank you so much, Tom. That was quite a comprehensive summary here of information for the entire group. If anybody has any questions for Tom, please put them in the chat, or you could use our Q&A. Or if you have any comments about the presentation you would like to let the entire group know about. I will be sending out a copy of the presentation slides along with the recording link, and then everybody will also receive one CEU for attending today's program.
You're also able to reach out to me. My contact information is there. So if you have a question or a comment or a follow-up, and there's no costs or obligation, be more than happy to, give you a response. You're welcome to reach out directly.
Thank you, Tom. I will actually include your contact information in the follow-up email that I send out later today. But I really do appreciate you bringing this topic. I think the entire presentation was very well put out. Lot of detail. You always give a lot of detail to all your presentations, which we really appreciate.
Good. Okay. And I threw a couple of ideas for you for maybe down the road. So
I know I was taking a lot of notes. Don't worry. So at this time, what I'll do, I don't see actually any questions for you, Tom. So I think you might have answered the questions when you were doing the presentation. At this time, I'd like to close out the program. Another thank you to you, Tom, for coming to ISM Rochester and presenting this important topic. especially after we've been through the last 3 years. So everybody have a great day, and look for an email later today from me with the information.
Thank you all. Happy New Year. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Tom.